Kristen from Maybe You Better Wanna Knit here today to talk to you about mistakes you should not make if you are ready to tackle your first sweater.
It's cold outside. You'll need a sweater. A sweater.
I say first sweater. Could be your 10th sweater, could be your 20th sweater. But these are some of the most common beginner mistakes that we tend to make less often as we become more experienced, or that we find different ways to work around as we become more experienced. But if it is your very first sweater, you really want to set a good foundation. So you want to make sure that you are not making these particular 5 mistakes so that you are more likely to have a successful project in the end. And again, any sweater knitter could make these mistakes, so maybe give it a watch even if you're not about to tackle your first sweater. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first one, you don't have to match the yarn that's called for in the pattern. That is not to say you can't match the yarn. If you want to, you absolutely should. But you don't want to get bogged down in the idea that you have to match the exact yarn that is called for in the pattern. You don't. So if the yarn that is called for in a particular sweater pattern is not available to you for whatever reason, or is outside of your budget, that doesn't mean you can't make your sweater. You absolutely can. Now, using the exact yarn that is called for in the sweater, is that going to help make sure that your project is a success? I mean, it couldn't hurt, but it's not a guarantee of anything either. What you do want to make sure you do is that you, especially if this is your first sweater, is that you match the weight of the yarn that is called for in the pattern. And by that, I don't just mean the name on the label, worsted, DK, whatever, but also you want to check your yards to ounces or meters to grams and make sure that your substitute yarn is similar. So you might have 2 different worsted weight yarns. One is 110 yards, 50 grams. The other is 130 yards, 50 grams. Those are not quite the same. One of those yarns is a little bit thinner. So you want to try to keep it in the same ballpark in terms of not just what it says on the label, but also the actual physical weight and yardage or meterage of the yarn. You also want to get pretty close to the fiber content. That is going to help ensure that your finished project looks much more like the one in the pattern. As you become more experienced, these rules aren't as hard and fast. You learn how to make substitutions, how to make adjustments. You learn how different fibers will impact your project and can make an educated decision based on that. But if you are tackling your first sweater, that's a lot of knowledge that just comes with it, practice and experience that you just don't have yet. So it is going to make your life simpler if you try to match the fiber content of that yarn as well, whatever it is. So if it's 100% non-superwash wool, you want to look for something like that. If it's superwash, you want to look for something like that. If the sweater is a 100% merino wool, choosing a 100% acrylic yarn, not a great idea for a lot of reasons, but mostly just because those fibers behave very differently. And to help ensure your success as a new sweater knitter, you want to kind of match as closely as you can what is in the pattern without getting bogged down in, again, matching the exact yarn. That is not a necessity. Next mistake, don't skip swatching.
The horror.
You have to swatch, especially if this is your first sweater. Again, as you gain more experience, you'll be more familiar with your general gauge, working with certain weight yarns on certain size needles. And you may, although I don't advise it, you may be able to fudge your swatching a little bit as you gain more experience. But for your first sweater, take the time to do the swatch. And taking that a step further, if your first sweater is something where part of the sweater is knit flat and part of the sweater is knit in the round, swatch for both. Again, as you gain more experience, you will start to learn about the differences between your flat and in the round swatching. So at some point it may no longer be necessary for you to swatch for both. You may just know, okay, most of the sweaters worked flat. When I go to knit the sleeves, those are worked in the round, so I need to go up a needle size. That may be something that as a more experienced knitter, you'll be able to tell. But doing your very first sweater, don't risk it. Do the swatch and make sure you match the pattern gauge. If this is your very first sweater, you really don't want to be trying to tackle all the math that will come with trying to make adjustments when you don't match the gauge. So do your swatches, both of them if necessary. If there's a pattern stitch that you need to swatch in, and usually the way you tell that is the designer is specifically going to say, here's your gauge in stockinette, and here's your gauge in this particular pattern repeat. Swatch for that as well. In order for your sweater to come out looking like the one in the pattern, your gauge needs to match the designer of the pattern's gauge. If it doesn't, your sweater's not going to come out the right size, and it might look different as well. It might drape differently, it might fit differently. The stitch patterns might look different. And again, your first sweater is not the time that you really want to experiment. So be sure you swatch and match that gauge. It is very important, assuming that you want your first sweater to fit you. Speaking of fit, your bra size is not your sweater size.
Bra size is not your sweater size.
I know it might seem like that. That is definitely what I thought when I started knitting sweaters. Oh, well, these numbers here, these look suspiciously like the same numbers that are on a bra band. This must be, you know, more or less that equivalent, so I'll just pick the one that's closest. No, that is not how we're going to pick a sweater size. It might be a good jumping off point if you have absolutely no other options, but assuming that you do, you want to actually take your measurements, and there are lots of good resources out there. I'm sure there are some on YouTube. I haven't done that particular video yet myself, and I'm sure there are some great resources on YouTube for how to take your own measurements and use that information to select your size. And your size is going to take into account not only the actual measurements of your body, but how closely or loosely you want your sweater to fit. So if your bra size is a 34B, you probably don't want to knit the size 34 sweater. That's going to give you absolutely no ease, no wiggle room. It's going to be the exact same size as your body. And generally speaking, that's not how we like our sweaters to fit, because it's not the 1950s anymore. Although there are certainly some sweaters out there that are designed to fit that way. The vast majority in the year 2023 are not. Another consideration is that while those numbers seem similar, bra bands and pattern measurements, your bra band does not take into account the actual size of your boobs. So you might be a 34, but you also might be a double D. And if you make that size 34 sweater, it's going to come out way too small, because there is a bit of room in a stockinette fabric for some stretch, but not that much. Your starting point is not going to be 34. Your starting point is going to be the measurement, the circumference around the fullest part of your chest, which is, generally speaking, right in the middle of your boobs. Some designers are adding more information to their patterns to help you make a better choice, such as a high bust measurement, which is sort of the measurement right under your arm, like your armholes here. And then they'll tell you, you know, if the difference between this measurement and the full bust measurement is such and such inches, you'll need to add bust darts, things like that. The basic information that you should have when trying to pick your sweater size is the circumference around the fullest part of your bust. That is the number you're going to use to choose your sweater size, not your bra band. Do not make the mistakes that I have made in the past. You will end up with a bunch of sweaters that either don't fit or fit like a 50s kind of sweater girl pinup, which may or may not be the look that you're going for. So take your actual measurements have that information so you can pick your size that way. And don't forget to factor in ease, which is how many extra inches you want beyond your actual body measurements, so that the sweater doesn't fit like a glove. It's not really supposed to. Number 4, jumping in without reading the pattern.
You didn't read this one either?
If you're a new sweater knitter, there's going to be a lot of stuff in the pattern that even if you read it might not make sense to you. And that's okay, because some stuff is going to come with actually doing it. You learn by doing. But you really need to read the pattern first anyway, so that you can say, oh, look, here's a link for this specific technique. I think I'll check that out. Or, oh, it says I've got to do this and this at the same time, so I need to remember that when I get to that part. Or I'm not familiar with this abbreviation and I don't see it here in the pattern. Where else could I maybe find it? The idea of reading the pattern first is not so that you're going to understand every single step in advance. It's so that if when you read through it, something in particular stands out to you as important to note, or that you need to look it up, you already have that information available to you, and you're not just coming upon it for the first time as you're working through the pattern. You've got the sweater on your needles, you're ready to go, and then all of a sudden you find out, oh wait, I was supposed to do this other thing first. Designers are human, so sometimes maybe they forget to add some additional materials that you needed at the front of the pattern, but then you're reading and realize that you actually need to grab a crochet hook to do some step, or you need some stitch markers or stitch holders, spare yarn, things like that. Hopefully all of that information is provided up front, but on the off chance that there's, again, designers are human and something has been left out and you find it later, you're going to be much happier if you've already read through the pattern and know that than when it's 11 o'clock at night and you're working on your sweater and suddenly you don't have something that you need. Or you're somewhere else, you don't have access to the internet, and all of a sudden you realize that there's a technique you don't know how to do. If you've checked ahead of time, maybe you've already looked that up, you've saved a video, you've saved some instructions somewhere, you found it in a book, so that you have that information there available to you when you need it. So again, I've been seeing some criticism recently online, people saying reading the pattern first, isn't going to solve problems because a lot of stuff is learned by doing, and that's absolutely true. You may think this technique doesn't make any sense to me, and then once you do it, you get it. That's not really what reading the pattern first is about, though. It's about just having all of the information readily available to you, knowing, what steps your pattern is moving in, so you have all the information ahead of time and you're not scrambling at an inconvenient time or inconvenient place with your pattern that you really want to make progress on, and now, you've hit a roadblock. So read the pattern first. Definitely couldn't hurt. And the last one, skipping blocking. Blocking is magic.
Magic.
This is also another reason I don't advocate for acrylic sweaters, because acrylic doesn't block well, and especially if you've got something, for example, like this, with this lace pattern with the eyelets here. If you are using an acrylic yarn and you go to block this, nothing's going to happen. It is just going to shrink back and all your eyelets are going to be lost. This already looks pretty good, just kind of stretched out on the sweater, but it's going to look, first of all, it's going to fit me a little bit better, but it is going to look much more open and visible once I have actually blocked it. Blocking is going to relax the fibers. You're going to be able to use pins to open up any lace work. It is going to help your cables pop. It is going to even out your stitches so that if you have some spots where maybe you made a little mistake and it doesn't look as neat and tidy as you would like, blocking is going to help with all of that. Blocking is not going to make your sweater, or it should not, make your sweater a dramatically different size. So if you are realizing as you're working that your sweater is too small and you think that's going to block out, you should not rely on blocking for that. The size of your sweater will change when you are blocking, but we're talking about an inch here or there. We're not talking about 4 inches. So don't rely on blocking to try to resize a sweater that is too small, but you absolutely do want to block your finished sweater for it to look its best. Blocking can seem tedious, but it really, really does make a difference. Not necessarily in the size of your sweater, but in the way it fits, in the way that it drapes, in the way that, sometimes things get bunched up when you're knitting and maybe there's a centered cable that looks like it's kind of a little bit off to the side. It doesn't belong there. It's supposed to be. All of that is going to get fixed when you take the time to block your finished sweater. The other thing is that I don't know about you, but I tend to carry my knitting projects all over the place. I've got a dog, I've got 2 cats, I've got 2 kids. By the time I'm done with the sweater, it is not the cleanest. It's got some fur in it and probably some dirt from my kids and sitting in my lap and somebody knocked it on the floor. And so, even if blocking weren't magic, washing your finished sweater is a really good idea. Just for that factor alone. Also, if you are using any kind of yarn that you suspect may leak dye, so especially if while you're knitting, it is literally getting on your fingers, you're going to want to wash out that excess dye before you try wearing your project, and your sweater is leaving dye behind on, the t-shirt that's underneath or the back of your sofa or whatever it might be. Another good reason that you want to definitely wash your finished project, but then you do want to take the time to block it. So don't, in future washes, you don't have to be so meticulous. So while you should never hang your sweaters to dry, that's a terrible idea. In the future, you may be able to, just drape them. If you've got I've got one of these accordion drying racks. And when I'm washing my sweaters and not blocking them, I might lay my sweater out kind of over the top 3 rungs and keep the sleeves up. It's not a whole laborious process. I'm just putting it there. But your first wash, you want to block. Lay it out flat. Try to stretch it out. Don't overstretch it, but try to stretch it out to the final dimensions that are given in the pattern so that it has the same proportions that you're seeing in the pattern photos. Open up your lace, help your cables pop, even out, ribbing can kind of get a little wonky. It might, especially when you, at the cast on or bind off edge, it might be a little too tight or too loose, and you can fix that up with a little bit of blocking. And it's really just going to make your sweater look its best. So take the time to block. It doesn't have to mean you sit there with a pin and pin every inch of your sweater out. That is not necessary, but you want to lay it flat. Do pin any particularly lacy parts so that those open up. You may want to put some pins at key points, bottom of the sleeves, tops of the shoulders, a neckline in particular, but it doesn't have to be like blocking a shawl. It's generally speaking not quite that intensive. But you do want to take the time to block those sweaters because that's how they're going to look their best when you are wearing your first finished successful sweater project. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned something, got a few tips if you're ready to tackle your first sweater knitting project. If you're looking for sweater patterns, I have about 30 in my portfolio, and you can find links to my Ravelry and Pay Hip shops in the box down below if you're looking for a good sweater pattern or two to tackle this fall now that we are into sweater weather. I also have plenty of sweater knitting tutorials here on the channel, different sweater techniques, tips, etc. So be sure to check that out as well. Thank you so much for joining me for this video, and I will see you soon in another video. Bye.